you very much. It's a big pleasure to be here, and I can promise that I will not be doing all the talking, because it is very interesting to me also to be here, because I hope that I can get some of your reflections. It is so crucially important that press is still interested, that journalists are still interested in this agenda. There might have been some saying when they left Copenhagen last year, okay, that was the big climate year, let's focus on something else. And there are definitely lots of other things that need attention. But then, for instance, we 2 days ago got the news that since last October and up till now, it has been the 12th hottest months ever recorded in the time of all weather climate recording in the world history. Just to start there to say that what we thought was a very urgent issue last year is still a very, very urgent issue. And I think that you have a key position also as journalists to try to report the facts. I used to be a journalist myself, and I know how tempting it is. If you have someone, saying A, this is white, and B, this is black, and then it's up to the listeners and the viewers and the readers themselves to decide what is factual. I think that particularly in the field of climate, it is extremely important also to convey what we know, some of the scientific evidence, to convey that to people. Because in the end, those of us who are politicians, we cannot do much unless there is a basic understanding among citizens why it's important to deal with these kind of things, particularly maybe in a time of crisis where people have a lot of other things to attend to. It is rather important to remember that this is not an old story. The climate story is not an old news. It is something that we have to sort of continue to communicate why it's very important that we address it. Now I'm going to talk about Cancun, but of course you cannot talk about Cancun unless you first just dwell 2 minutes on Copenhagen. And nobody would probably be in doubt that I would very much have liked to see the international binding deal coming out of Copenhagen. So when we did not get that, was everything then lost? As you can imagine, I would argue no, because what happened in the last 6-7 months up to Copenhagen was actually quite an achievement. In the last 6-7 months up to Copenhagen, we saw where Europe normally were the only region who had set domestic regional targets up to 2020. In the run-up to Copenhagen, a lot of other countries set domestic targets. For instance, Russia did in June 29. Japan followed with their new government. And then we had also, as a total new thing, domestic targets in countries like Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Singapore, China, India, South Africa. The list is even longer. That is actually one of the major achievements that came out of all this mobilization. And of course, to set domestic target is not the same as to making them international legally binding, and that's some of the issues that we still have to discuss and we are still working on. But it is important when I say a country like Brazil say that they will deviate from their business as usual in the proportion of 35 to 38%, and they get that legislation and the following legislation through their parliament, then it actually changes something in the way they carry out and carry on with energy, climate, environment, growth, things like that. So that was one major achievement in Copenhagen. Another one was that the emerging economies for the first time ever acknowledged that without them contributing somehow, it would not be possible for the world to handle climate change, to tackle climate change. Today, this sounds as a only logical thing. But for those of us who have been dealing with this for a number of years, we know that even just 1 or 2 years back, if we have said, okay, in Copenhagen, India and China and others, they will acknowledge that they will be part of the solution, they will have to be part of the solution, then people 2 years ago would have said, oh no, that's not going to happen that fast. So that actually did happen. And of course, we also had the agreement on finance, the 2-degree targets, new language on MRV, and other things. So what now for Cancun? Well, in the spring, where the new commission came in, the easiest thing for Europe would have been to say, now Cancun will have to deliver everything that Copenhagen did not deliver. That would have been a very easy position for Europe, because we were ready to sign up to an internationally binding deal in Copenhagen, and of course we still are. I will come back to that point. But we thought that that would not be very helpful to the Mexican incoming presidency, because you can make a mobilization as we did up to Copenhagen once. You cannot make it twice unless you are sure that then you can deliver. So we said, instead, now we must pursue a stepwise approach. What does that mean? Well, we said, let's try to be very, very practical in Cancun and decide in a number of areas very specific decisions leading to specific action. Because at that time in the spring, we could see no positive news coming out of Washington, no news signals coming out of China. In other words, some of the key parties did not sort of move their positions, and it was easy to see that the political will that was not present in Copenhagen would not be that likely to be present in Cancun, so we could not just sort of repeat the story. So we said, okay, this stepwise approach, and what does that then mean? What could be the elements? Well, first, what will we not get in Cancun? We will, unfortunately, not get the internationally binding deal done. And as I said, it's not because of the European Union. We signed Kyoto, we pledged under Kyoto, and we actually overachieved compared to what we have pledged. We have delivered compared to what we pledged. But furthermore, all our legislation, and I know that during today and yesterday you have been sort of informed about what that is, then all this legislation is built on Kyoto principles. We do not mind Kyoto. Why should we? All our legislation up to 2020 is built basically on Kyoto principles. So we are not the problem. It's not Europe standing in the way for the world not getting the international deal done by Cancun. But as others have this problem, what can we then achieve? We think that, first of all, we should cash in on the Copenhagen Accord. We must not backtrack from what was agreed in the Copenhagen Accord. Around 140 countries have now signed up to the Copenhagen Accord. I know that is not 194, the number of countries that will be present at the UNFCCC negotiations, but still I think it's crucially important that Cancun does not start to reopen, to backtrack compared to what was agreed in Copenhagen. So that is the first thing. Cash in on the Copenhagen Accord, including the 2-degree targets. That must be sort of now embedded in the formal negotiations, fast start financing, and the MRV language. That is the first thing. Then, of course, the developed countries must deliver on their financial pledges from Copenhagen. The developed countries pledged, as you know, to deliver $30 billion this year, next year, and 2012 combined in these 3 years. And it's crucially important that when we come to Cancun, it is clear to all the developing countries that the developed countries, also as a group, has delivered. Europe will deliver. We have pledged that. It has been through our finance ministers. All the countries have sort of pledged whatever they're going to deliver, and the Commission money is also there. So there is no doubt the $7.2 billion over the 3 years that Europe pledged in Copenhagen will be delivered. Some of the money is already out there working in different projects in different countries, and we will account for that and inform on that when we come to Cancun. Then we should also be able to agree on a forestry framework. That was actually one of the areas where there was substantial progress in Copenhagen. And I would argue that the world is ready to sign up to a forestry decision. Not that I do not know that there are still some details here and there, but basically we know what the deal will have to look like. It's a question of political will. If the political will is there in Cancun, we can definitely take a decision on forestry and to halt deforestation, the so-called REDD+ initiative. We also believe that we should be able, likewise, to make an adaptation framework. Also there was substantial progress in Copenhagen. So that should also be a specific deliverable from Cancun. Maybe also together with a technology framework. We are pushing hard for this. Let's see if we will manage to do it. But forestry, adaptation, technology, deliverable of fast start financing, not backtracking from the Copenhagen Accord, and then also getting progress in the field of MRV, how to measure, report, and verify. Why is that latter point important? Well, it's very important in an interdependent world where it means a lot that what parties are committing to, that we also have the transparency knowing that they're actually delivering it. That is crucially important. I know this MRV thing sounds very technical. I at least think that it sounds very technical, but it's rather important to make progress here. It's important for a lot of political reasons, but I also think that in reality it is really crucial that we make progress there, because we must also make a balance package in Cancun. In other words, we cannot just make progress, say, for instance, among the Kyoto countries. It must be balanced between the tracks, but it must, of course, also be balanced in the sense that we do not just give away sort of the goodies, solve the easy things, and then all the difficult stuff is left for somebody else to take care of later. Also there, we must try to have a balance. That is what we have other things I could mention. Carbon markets, the reform of the CDM is crucially important. Maybe we can come back to that. And of course, still we need the whole discussion about mitigation targets. One thing is that leaders in Copenhagen agreed to stay below the 2 degrees. But how on earth are they going to do that unless people are delivering more when it comes to targets? Why did I not mention that first? Well, because the reality is that, again, due to the lack of legislation in the United States, it's not very likely that Cancun will be the big place to have sort of new targets come to the table. But our thinking is, if we can agree on the other elements that I mentioned, adaptation, forestry, technology, finance, maybe some long-term financial architecture could also make progress on the MRV, eventually on carbon markets and CDM reform, then we would also pave the way for South Africa, saying now we have proven the political will to agree on substances there. So it's very clear to all the parties what's in this for them. Then it might be easier later on to agree on the future legal form. That is sort of the thinking. And when we in March suggested this stepwise approach, we were more or less alone in saying this. Now I think that today that is what more or less all parties will agree. That is what we should try to achieve by Cancun. Final point on Cancun. You would probably ask, some of you, will Europe take a second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol? As I said, we have no problems basically with the Kyoto Protocol. So the easy answer could be, yeah, of course we can. But the answer is not that simple. Because yes, we could be ready to take a second commitment period. But it will be provided others also commit to something, and it would be provided we solve the issues with the lack of environmental integrity in the Kyoto Protocol, particularly in 2 fields. We have a problem with what we call hot air, the so-called AAUs. And maybe we can come back more detailed to that. But just to say that in the world today, we have around 11 billion tons of hot air, of AAUs. 8 billion in Russia, 3 billion in Europe. If we just carried on with these 11 billion tons of hot air and allowed them in the system after 2012, it would more or less level out all the other initiatives Europe would be taking up to 2020. In other words, that would not be a very wise strategy. Here we have something that we have to sort of look into, and the same can be said for the LULUCF accounting rules, another technical area. But in these two areas, we need to make some improvement on the setup in order to protect the environmental integrity of the Kyoto Protocol if it were to continue up to, say, 2020 or even longer. You could say, why set up conditions? Why not just unconditional say, okay, we take a second commitment period. Some have suggested we should say we take it up to 2018. There are two reasons for that. If we just set it unconditionally, the first thing that would happen would be that the political pressure up to 2018 would be taken off the shoulders of the US, China, others. That would be the first consequence. They could lean back and relax and, okay, now we have solved this problem. The other thing is that there would be absolutely not one extra reduced ton of CO2 because Europe took a second commitment period. Not one extra ton of CO2. As you know, the world cannot afford that we are just continuing business as usual up to 2018. So that is why we have to do this on conditions. And we cannot afford to remove the pressure on others to deliver. For each year others postpone action here, it will end being much more difficult to stay below the 2 degrees threshold, as was said last year. So final point, can Cancun then deliver the package that I just sketched out? I think it is doable. I think it is possible. But I also do think that all parties must realize that then we need the will to compromise now. If there is one thing we learned or ought to have learned from Copenhagen, is that if you waste too much time with all parties, keeping their cards and not wanting to compromise, maybe before the very last moment, then you have a risk that you never come to that very last moment. You have to start to solve some of the problems now, at the pre-COP, at some of the meetings that will be up to Cancun, because there simply is a limit as to how much can be solved in these relatively few days there. I believe that it is crucial that Cancun delivers. Why is that? I think maybe also some of you would say, and I know that a lot of delegates, when they left home from Copenhagen last year, said, oh, this horrible, slow, inefficient UN process. Can't we just get rid of that? It's probably not that difficult. And definitely it's very easy to see the challenges and the problems in this slow UN process. But it's much more difficult to see what would be the alternative. Some would say G20. Okay. So far, China and India said they do not want to discuss this in G20. G8 would make no sense. The countries representing in G8 is accounting for still less of global emissions. It wouldn't make much sense. G2, well, China and the US had a lot of bilaterals last year, a lot of G2 meetings, without making a lot of progress. My point is just, it's not that easy to say that if just we discussed it in another forum, then suddenly, miraculously, we could solve some of the problems that were the obstacles in Copenhagen and that will still be the obstacle. So in order to keep the UN process, keep the momentum there, it is crucial that Cancun delivers substantial progress so that people can see that this is a viable pathway. In Europe, and we can come back to that now in your questions, in Europe we believe that it is very important to keep the international negotiations moving. We will do whatever we can to push them forward. And we will also do whatever we can still to pursue a legally binding agreement next year in South Africa. But we have, of course, also sort of our own sort of home region. And there we can come back to your questions, maybe, if you have some in this field. I just think that it dawns on still more countries that if you do this wisely, if you address climate change wisely, it does not have to interfere with your growth. It's the other way around. If you do it intelligently, you can create growth, you can enhance your energy security, you can promote your wealth by doing this. And I'm in no doubt that the economies that best understand this for the years to come, they will also prosper the most. Not so much because of the climate and the 2 degrees and the 450 ppms and all these difficult stuff, but simply because of the fact that in a world where we are going to be 9 billion people, when my children will be my age, instead of the 6.7 billion we are now, then it goes without saying that energy and resource efficiency will in any case be a competitive parameter. And the regions and the countries and the sectors and the businesses that understand that first and simply just do it, I'm absolutely sure that they will also prosper the most. I end here. As you can hear, climate negotiations is about a lot of things. The future growth, who would get a share in what. It's about security, it's about migration, it's about climate, it's about energy, it's about environment, it's about a lot of things. That's, of course, also why progress is slow. But basically, I will argue that the countries of the world, the politicians of the world, they know what they ought to do. Now it's a question of whether the will to make the necessary compromises are there. If the will is there, if people learn from last year, then we could deliver a substantial package from Cancun, and that is definitely what the EU will try to secure. And we hope that a lot of other countries will join us in this effort.